how can an omniscient, omnipotent, and all-good God ordain and allow all kinds of evil, injustice, oppression in the world? Now, this was not really a big problem. Well, it's always been a problem and an issue, but it was primarily after the so-called Enlightenment in the 1600s, when people lost the idea of the biblical God, and many became agnostics or deists, people that thought God created the world but then basically left us on our own and is not intimately involved in the world. Then the so-called problem of evil became much bigger, and it's been written about just an incredible amount. The philosopher who really sort of brought the modern problem of evil to the forefront was an Englishman named David Hume, who in the 1770s, in his book Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, stated the classic problem of evil like this. He said, "Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent, evil. Is he both able and willing? Well, then whence then is evil?" Or to put it another way, if God exists, then he's omnipotent and perfectly good. A perfectly good God would eliminate evil as far as it could, and there's no limit to what an omnipotent being can do. Therefore, if God exists, there would be no evil in the world. Number two, there is evil in the world. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, that's basically what is known as the logical problem of evil. But we need to understand, even leading atheist philosophers admit that now no one has succeeded in establishing the logical problem of evil, because there have been fairly compelling arguments for the view that the existence of evil is logically compatible or consistent with the existence of God. And as a result, most atheist philosophers who raise the problem of evil basically say that they take the reality of evil as evidence that God's existence is unlikely rather than impossible. Now, this is what is known as the inductive or the evidential problem of evil. And so they admit that while the existence of evil is not logically incompatible with the existence of an omnipotent and good God, but the existence of evil, particularly the amount of evil, the depth of evil, and so on, and the seeming pointlessness of much evil is evidence that God probably does not exist. And so, as one Christian philosopher points out, that it is acknowledged on almost all sides that the logical argument is bankrupt, but the inductive argument from evil is still very much alive and kicking. Now, we've seen in Habakkuk that the issue was raised, but the book does not provide, at least directly, a comprehensive theodicy or explanation for the existence of evil. What the book shows, of course, is that God is omnipotent, he is omniscient, he is good, he knows exactly what is going on, he has a comprehensive plan, and that God is a God of justice. He will bring all evil and evildoers into judgment. And also, of course, he is infinitely wise. And so Habakkuk deals with the problem of evil from a somewhat different starting point than do non-believing philosophers. They start from the fact of rampant evil and ask, How can God, if there is a God, ordain or allow this? And of course, a lot of individuals, if they have had really bad things happen to them or to their loved ones, for many of them, it drives them away from God. I cannot believe in a God who would allow this to happen. Now, Habakkuk raises the exact same questions, but he does not add the clause, if God exists. Instead, Habakkuk begins from a position of faith. He knows that God exists. He knew that God is good and wise and glorious, and that he has a comprehensive plan. And by putting God first, and by putting what we know to be true about God as our starting point, then we, like Habakkuk came to see in chapter 3, we can understand by a faith based on fact that God's existence, omnipotence, omniscience, and goodness are all still intact and are not affected by the existence of widespread evil. We may question, why are you doing this? How long are you going to let this? And we may have serious questions about God, just as Habakkuk did, just as Job did, just as Asaph in Psalm 73 did. But again, it depends upon our starting point. And we need to know God. We need to know that he exists, and we need to know what he is like. That is found in the Bible. And there are all kinds of other sources that deal with this, what's called apologetics, the existence of God, that are beyond the scope of this lecture and this book. But all that being said, what I want to do in these next few lectures is deal with the problem of evil and the issue of theodicy, explaining it, or what might be better said, defenses to the problem of evil in somewhat more detail, because these are profoundly important issues, and the existence of evil is a main stumbling block for a lot of people. Now, to begin dealing with this, we need to understand that a good, omnipotent God is necessary even to talk coherently about good and evil. What do I mean? Well, the Bible reveals that God is holy and just and righteous and good, and yet sin and evil exist. Now, many people find it hard to reconcile how God can be entirely good and absolutely sovereign, and yet reign over a world containing rampant sin and evil. But even to make that argument against God assumes that some things are, in fact, objectively evil. As one writer says, to say something is evil is to make a moral judgment. And moral judgments make no sense outside of a moral standard. Evil can't be real if morals are relative. Evil is real, though. That's why people object to it. Therefore, objective moral standards must exist as well. So what is the source for objective moral standards? Well, the only source big enough to determine whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, or moral or immoral, the only ground or standard is God himself. Because a lot of people today, particularly in the West, think, well, morals are all relative. It's what I think or what the culture dictates. Well, if that's true, you can never say that anything is evil. It might be wrong for that particular culture, but a different culture allows it. Or I might think it's wrong, but that's just my opinion. You might think it's right. There's no basis for moral judgments outside of an adequate ground or standard, and that can only be God. And in fact, atheists and non-believers admit that. Famous atheist, Marxist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre said, and he was what's called an existentialist. He said, the existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. And he said, If God does not exist, are we provided with any values or commands that could legitimize our behavior? We have none behind us, none before us. We have no means of justification or excuse for what we do if God does not exist. And that's an atheist admitting that. A non-Christian philosopher by the name of Richard Taylor similarly admits the modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong without noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. And so the consequences of this are twofold. Number one, by casting aside God and his word, which is the only basis for right and wrong and moral obligation, we have brought sin and evil on ourselves, and God rightly holds us accountable for it. That began back in the garden with Adam and Eve. They cast aside God's word, and they brought sin and evil, which has affected all of creation. Secondly, the problem of evil is a far greater problem for atheists and other unbelievers in God and the Bible than it is for Christians. And the reason, as I mentioned, is non-believers have no rational, adequate, or coherent, which means internally consistent, not self-contradictory. They have no basis to claim that any human law or action is truly, objectively, or universally unjust, wrong, and evil. They may oppose it personally, but that simply is their personal opinion. And so when atheists say, this is wrong, this is evil, what Christian philosopher Greg Bahnsen says, what we find then is the unbeliever must secretly rely upon the Christian worldview in order to make sense of his argument concerning the existence of evil. Anti-theism presupposes theism, God, in order to make its case. The problem of evil, therefore, is a logical problem for the unbeliever, not for the believer. In fact, in a debate with an atheist, Christian philosopher William Lane Craig put this in the form of a logical syllogism. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2. Objective moral values do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. Now, noted Christian writer C.S. Lewis recognized that the issue goes far beyond atheism's inability to account for the existence of right and wrong and good and evil, but it strikes at the very heart of atheism itself. In his book Mere Christianity, Lewis, who himself had been an atheist, wrote, "My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. Of course, I could have given up my idea of justice by saying that it was nothing but a private idea of my own. But if I did that, then my argument against God collapsed too. For the argument depended on saying that the world was really unjust, not simply that it did not happen to please my private fancies." So, in other words, he realized that the only basis, adequate basis, for saying that anything is good or bad, just or unjust, moral or immoral, is God himself. Nothing else is adequate to raise that as a standard, and therefore Lewis realized, by saying that the world is unjust, I'm admitting that God has to exist. Otherwise, it's just my private opinion. Now, there are a number of things that make the atheist arguments against God, based on the existence of evil, invalid. We, as Christians, can have confidence that the existence of evil is not evidence against either God's existence or his goodness. because God has a morally sufficient reason for ordaining and permitting every evil, although he may not have revealed the reason to us. One writer says, puts it like this: a being is not morally culpable in allowing preventable evil unless a being is not morally culpable in allowing preventable evil if he has a morally sufficient reason for so doing. And therefore, the answer to David Hume's and other, phrasings of the problem of evil is simply that, number one, a totally good God will prevent all evil unless he has a morally sufficient reason for permitting its existence. Number two, evil exists. Number three, therefore, God has a morally sufficient reason for permitting the existence of evil. And, Abraham had this view in Genesis 18. He said, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" And as Paul said in Romans, "Let God be found true, though every man be found a liar." And we know, looking at God's character, particularly look at Jesus Christ, who is the perfect representation of God, that he is moral, he is wise, he is omniscient and omnipotent, and therefore we know that whatever he does is right, and therefore he has a morally sufficient reason for allowing everything that happens in this world. We'll talk more about this in subsequent lectures, but so that defeats the logical problem of evil, but it also is fatal to the so-called inductive or evidential problem of evil. John Feinberg observes that theists and atheists both agree that evil's existence is consistent with God's existence. In other words, an omnipotent good God can exist and evil can exist at the same time. But and theists have offered reasons to back this up, and we'll talk some more about that later on. But since that is true, how likely is it that evil can be evidence that God's existence is improbable? Since even atheists admit that God's existence is compatible with the existence of evil, then how can you say that, but his existence is improbable? That makes no sense at all. As Feinberg concludes, having admitted that evil can fit with God, how can the atheist hope to show that evil does not fit with God and thus is evidence that makes his existence improbable? Now, I mentioned that atheists typically point to the great quantity of evil in the world, the intensity of much evil, torture, extremely painful diseases, the apparent pointlessness or gratuitousness of much evil. Something that, how can anything good come from this? And they look to natural evils, floods, earthquakes, diseases, in making their inductive argument. The problem, however, is that these arguments are based on the hidden premise that God does not have a morally sufficient reason for allowing these sorts of evils. But that's just an assertion that cannot be proven. And further, within that hypothesis is another assumption. Basically, it's if I can't see any reasons God might have for permitting that evil, then probably he doesn't have any either. But that is obviously false. A God who is infinitely more powerful than us is also infinitely more knowledgeable and wiser than us. So the rejoinder to the skeptic is, if God has infinite knowledge, why couldn't he have a morally sufficient reason for allowing evil that you can't think of? To insist that we know as much about life as the all-powerful God is a logical fallacy. And since atheists cannot prove that God has no morally sufficient reasons for allowing various evils, their inductive or evidential probability arguments of necessity must also fail. Now, there are a number of other reasons why the inductive argument cannot get off the ground. First, in making any inductive argument or a judgment as to the probability of something, in other words, the probability that God exists, you have to base the argument and the judgment on all of the evidence relevant to the theory. It's impossible to calculate probabilities of any given hypothesis without incorporating background information. Because what may be improbable under one set of evidence may be probable on another. And therefore, anyone making an argument against God must offer good reasons apart from the existence of evil as to why God does not exist. Because without that background information, appeal to evil's existence alone accomplishes nothing other than reinforcing a foregone conclusion. But the problem with all atheists is the only evidence they cite is the existence of evil itself. You see, the background information they need, all the evidence has to be considered to say this is probable or not probable. So that would include such things as the implausibility of the universe coming into existence by itself, the implausibility of life coming from non-living matter, the implausibility of mind and consciousness coming from non-sentient, non-thinking beings, the inability of non-sentient forces to account for things like logic, truth, right, wrong, evidence of design in the universe, fulfilled prophecy, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Because basically Jesus said, I am God come to earth as a man, and I will prove it by doing something that anyone who is only a man could not do. Namely, they will kill me, I'll be really dead, I'll be buried, but on the third day I will bodily rise from the dead. If he did that, that validates who he is, namely God come to earth in the flesh, and it validates everything he said. Atheists never bring that up. Other things, such as the evidence of miracles and experiences of divine and supernatural encounters. That's just some of the evidence that needs to be taken into account to determine, along with the existence of evil, does God really exist? You see, the atheist's failure to take any of that into account and only focus on the existence of evil makes it impossible to even begin making an argument, because the fact of evil, standing alone, has no evidential value whatsoever in trying to assess the probability of God's existence. John Feinberg also makes the point when they say that, evil shows that the existence of God is improbable. Feinberg points out you should ask the theist, or ask the atheist, evidence against which God? Because until the atheist specifies which conception of God is under attack and which conception of God I'm defending, it's impossible to assess the success of the attack or the defense. Because the atheist's own view of what he or she thinks God would do or is like is totally irrelevant. That is why we need to go, we can therefore say, the only God that I am defending, the only God there is the biblical God, the Christian God. And so that enables us as background information to go to the Bible, which is why, for example, the premise we talked about, the logical premise is God would remove all evil unless he had a morally sufficient reason for not doing so. But another writer said that he proposed the proposition as to why God's existence is consistent with the existence of evil. He proposed the proposition that Adam responsibly and freely chose to disobey God, to eat the forbidden fruit, after which time he and all of creation fell. Now that resolves the alleged incompatibility between the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, and good God and the existence of evil. He chose that because he wanted to use as much biblical data to show that the real God, is consistent with the existence of evil, so he goes back to how evil came into the world and its implications and effects on all people and on the world itself. Now, the atheist's argument is also invalid for a related reason, namely that it is nothing but an assertion of what the atheist thinks God would do or should do. Or, in other words, it postulates that if God exists, reality would be considerably different from what it is. That's not based upon any empirical or observed data at all. Yes, we can observe evil, many different kinds of evil, but we cannot observe the evaluation of that data. We cannot observe God's relation to the evils. We cannot determine how they should be evaluated. Is there too much evil? Is it pointless? What are the reasons for it? So basically, the atheist argument amounts to the assumption that I know what God should do and what he would do, but that person is not God. In other words, the atheist is proceeding along the lines that if I would prevent certain evils, then God should too. But think of the arrogance of that, because they cannot give even one example of any specific evil that is truly pointless. So they might say it does not appear to have any point, but that's not good enough, because, again, the fact that God is infinitely more knowledgeable than we and has infinitely greater vision than we do and is infinitely wiser means that we can never know the reasons. As one Christian philosopher, he analogized our understanding of God's reasons for allowing evil to the likelihood of a 1-month-old infant trying to understand his parents' purposes in allowing him to experience certain pain, which is to say, not likely at all. But the difference between our knowledge and understanding and God's is infinitely greater than between a 1-month-old infant and the parents. And as Timothy Keller points out, that if an all-powerful, all-wise God were directing all of history with its infinite number of interactive events toward good ends, it would be folly to think that we could look at any particular occurrence and understand a millionth of what good it will bring about. In other words, we simply do not know and cannot know, and God has not told us, in the vast majority of cases, his reasoning. And so, if you're debating with an atheist, and the atheist, you come up with various proposals, I think this might be behind this, this might be the reason. If the atheist shoots down every one of them, the atheist would still face the insurmountable task of showing that there are no further possibilities that he or she hasn't thought of. That point itself would be decisive. And in fact, even David Hume, who raised this modern problem of evil, admitted that it is likely that there will be all kinds of solutions or reasons which will forever escape our comprehension. And the fact of the matter is, God may deal differently with each specific act of evil. He may have ordained one thing for one reason, a very similar thing for another reason. It may affect people, it may affect the evildoer, it may affect the victim, it may affect others, it may have effects in the supernatural realm. There are just all kinds of things absolutely beyond our kin or our ability ever to understand. And therefore, it is impossible to make any kind of a probability argument and saying that, well, God's existence is improbable. We will look at more of this in the next lecture.